Hey folks, this is Kalori. Welcome to Scrum and Agile Digest. So more of what we talked about in product backlog, it's going to consider risk, business value, dependencies. It's owned by the product owner. It's an ordered list of everything. It's a single source of requirement for the products. It's prioritized by organizational value. It's going to be a huge repository of all your user stories, features, epics. It's going to have a small chunk of user stories. Basically, the team is going to go ahead and select a small chunk of user stories from the product backlog during the backlog grooming sessions. And, as long as they're prioritized, they start working on it. And the small chunk of user stories will be included in the sprint backlog, and it's never complete. The product backlog is never complete. It's a dynamic document and it's constantly changing and evolving. Now let's talk a little bit about, user stories, right? Now you might think, hey, user stories is just a couple of, sentences that describes what I want. Yes, true, but, it's much more than that. And, you have to make sure the user story is clear enough, transparent enough that the person who's reading it is able to understand it and implement it. Because you don't want to waste too much time because sprint is small, right? It's a time boxed. You don't want to spend too much going back and forth with the product owner trying to understand it. So sometimes it's unavoidable, but the best is try to make your best decision in the beginning itself. Make it as clear as possible. The hierarchy of the stories in the product backlog, we already talked about this. We have teams, we can have initiatives, we can have epics, and then the user story level. We can have user stories, and then the user stories can be further broken down into tasks and subtasks, which are usually consumed in a single sprint. Okay, now what is a good user story, right? So when you write a user story, you can have certain things in mind. For instance, I like to follow the 3 C's of writing a good user story. A good user story should have a card, it should have a composition, and it can have a confirmation. And by card, I mean, let's take our previous example of the e-commerce marketplace website, right? A card could be, as a user, I want to be able to choose a product on the website so that I can purchase it, right? So I am defining who the user is. That's the role. It has to be customer centric. I'm saying that there is a goal, that is choose a product, and there's a benefit that is purchase it. There's a benefit that the user will get through this user story. So try to have these three things in mind. And if you kind of follow this, and there are many other methods like invest, smart principle. You'll be able to automatically write the user story from the perspective of the customer, what their goal is, how they're going to benefit from it. So a good user story, make sure, it has a description, right? It should have, for instance, again, throughout this lesson, I'm going to talk about that e-commerce website marketplace. So let's say in my product page, I should have a product name, which could be a mandatory text field. You can have a product category, which can be a drop down from the master category. You can have a product description, which is a text or mandatory. You can have a cost. You can have a brand, which is searchable. You can have a model. And the description will be given by the product owner, right? Or even the subject matter expert. And it can come from the product backlog. And, you can even have, when you're writing user stories, you can have mock-ups, screenshots, UML diagrams, right? Wireframes that describes how your product page will look like, right? Initially, you may not have all the details of the user story, and that's the beauty of Scrum. You don't have everything written down. All the requirements are not there for you. But during the product backlog, you will start adding more and more details to your stories, right? You will also add an acceptance criteria. That is very, very important. You should always have a definition of done. That is the acceptance criteria based on which your product will be accepted by your product owner. Then, continuing on the good user story, with the same example of the e-commerce website, we want to make sure the user is able to search for the product by the product name. You should have a product description, cost, model. If the product is not available, you should have, a message that flashes that the product is unavailable. You can even give some competitive similar products, give suggestions to the users. The user is able to add the product to a cart. All user validation should display correct validation messages. You might want to display a different language, right? Because your product might be in other countries, like let's say Russia or Japan or China, where English may not be the primary language. So you can, you can build your website in such a way that it shows a different kind of language based on the geolocation of the user, wherever they're logging in from. And then you can have a different cost denomination, like a different currency based on their geographic location. So these are some things you have to keep in mind for user stories, depending on what kind of a user story you're trying to write, what your product is. The 3 C's should work in any situation. And then the most important thing is, like I said, you should have a definition of ready, a definition of done, which shows you that the story is complete. What is the acceptance criteria? For instance, for an example of the product page, right? You should have some basic validation checks. Should be part of the acceptance criteria. Let's say a user is logging in. You want to have an acceptance criteria for that. You should have basic validation checks. You reject any invalid password characters. You can have like a limit, right? They try, let's say 5 or 6 times. After they get locked out, they are sent a message or an email to reset their password or create a new account. So these are the acceptance criteria that you can probably have for login page. Right? Similarly, you can build acceptance criteria for any other user story that you're looking at. Now, let's talk about the types of user stories. Now, every user story should have a test, a unit test. It should be testable, right? You should be able to test it and make sure that it's working according to the way you wanted it to work. It follows the acceptance criteria. And again, you should have a continuous integration, right? You test it, you provide your feedback, you change the code if need be, you test it again, it's ready, right? And then there are so many tools out there, DevOps tools today to do version control. You have Jenkins and so many other tools basically where you can push your code, test it, and then push it to master branch and make sure that nobody's overwriting each other's code, right? And everything is tested. So make sure every user story has testing part built in. You can have discovery stories, which are basically stories that you've discovered, which can be for future development, may not be for the current sprint. And then, they go back to the product backlog and they'll be prioritized at a future time. And you can also have technical spikes, which you will analyze and research. Again, it's for future development and it will go back to the product backlog. Now, going back to the product backlog, we already talked about this. It has epics, themes, stories, tasks. Themes are long-term objectives. Initiative is a collection of epics that drive towards a common goal. And initiatives can actually last for years, right? You can have a big, selling a product on an e-commerce website is a huge initiative that can last for multiple years. And then you break it down into smaller epics, which are a collection of related stories, which you can probably complete in months. And then, a requirement that you can do in one sprint, okay, or a major deliverable that you can basically deliver in multiple agile features. So a user story which is basically a smaller version of an epic, right? It can be completed in days. Usually, it should be you should be able to complete it in the sprint time box. And then the user stories can be further broken down into tasks, which you will be working on in sprints. And the tasks should be small enough that you should be able to complete it in hours, right, within a sprint. So there's some examples here. For example, let's say you have a music streaming service, right? The theme on the top, and if you follow, let's say, a work breakdown structure or something, theme for a music stream, you can have a theme for a music streaming service, and this will have all the strategic initiatives driven towards organizational goals, like making music streaming seamless and shareable. Then you can increase customer engagement and simplify the user experience, implement new architecture to improve performance. These are all big initiatives, right? Which are kind of vague, right? But they're very strategic towards your organizational goals and initiative. And then epic, right? Which is a collection of epics. You can have a collection of epics that will drive towards a common goal, like a product roadmap, right? Like you can say, as a user, I can use my playlists as a way of connecting with other users. So that is like a child of your parent initiative, right, where you wanted to stream music. So these could be epics. Engineer the application to support future growth. Again, it's vague, but it's less vague compared to the initiative. We support integration with external services, support mobile applications, recommend music to users based on their interest. Now, coming to stories, right? Stories are, again, you can drill down, decompose the epic further, and you get a story, and then a user story could be like, you should be able to share the playlist which they are creating on social media. Users should be able to like or favorite other users' playlists. Users should be able to invite other users to view their playlist. Users should be able to upload and edit content. So, see, I'm breaking down the epic further into user stories which can be completed in a sprint, right? And then, you basically break down user story further into tasks which you're doing in certain hours. Now, we talked about this as well. The user story should be always written from the perspective of the end user, right? So who is the user, right? It's going to be a customer, employee. You should have a what, it is a goal. What is the functionality that the user wants to achieve or develop? Why? Is the reason. Why does the user want to do this, right? What goal are they trying to accomplish by doing this user story, right? So write a user story in this format. As a user, my role, I want to do certain XYZ so I can achieve ABC. Give a reason as to why you want to do this thing. So like as a user, I want to log in so I can access subscriber content. It has a user, it has a goal, it has a reason. Now, story points. Now, what exactly is story points? Now, user stories, when we break it down into tasks, right? We need the team assigns story points to it. Story points is a relative sizing of the stories. There are multiple methods out there. There's t-shirt sizing, there's planning poker, there's estimation buckets, but there's a way in which they size the story relatively. So here it's just an example of a t-shirt sizing. So you have extra small, medium large, extra large. So basically based on your understanding of the story, the team members will say, hey, the story is small enough, I can do it in a couple of hours. So you do it in 3 hours. It's a small story. or maybe extra small. You do it in 5 hours, it's a small story. You do take 8 hours, it's a medium story. If you take 13 hours, it's a large, extra large. Anything usually beyond 13 hours, you should consider that as an epic and break it down further into smaller user stories. And we will talk more about the planning poker and the t-shirt sizing and what is relative sizing as such. And then this is another method of writing user stories we talked about, which is the INVEST. It's an acronym that stands for Independent, Negotiable, Valuable, Estimable, Small, and Testable. So it's pretty self-explanatory here. When you write a user story, make sure that it can be a standalone user story. It doesn't have any dependencies on other user stories. Right? It should be negotiable. It can be changed. It should be valuable. It should be able to add value. It should be able to fit in a sprint, and it should be small enough that you're able to fit it in a sprint, right? And then you should be able to test it. It should have an acceptance criteria. There should be a definition of done, and you might have stories which are clustered together into epics. And we saw this before. A group of related stories or epics, right? It makes a product roadmap. Another acronym for writing good stories, it's SMART stories. So what does S stand for? S is specific, M is measurable, A is achievable, R is relevant, and T is time bound. So basically by that I mean, it should be specific, there should be a proper mission statement, you should be able to measure it, there should be some metrics around it, they should be tangible, achievable. Don't say that, you want to create a rocket ship in one sprint. Probably not going to work, right? Something that a team can achieve. Should be relevant. You try to have something which is relevant in the industry, which the customer actually wants. There's a demand for it, right? And it should be time bound, right? You just don't have a story which, you want to build a NASA, you want to build a rocket ship, right? It's going to take you a long time to build it, which is fine. But don't say that you want to build it in one sprint. It's not going to work, right? You might just build one component of that. Make sure it's time bound. So again, pretty much, I don't want to drain the slide. It's, make sure the story is short, unambiguous, attainable, can be standalone. And then, we talked about the product backlog grooming as well. What are the advantages? They'll remove any uncertainties, unknowns from the stories. If you need any clarification, elaboration, they will help you in that. They'll split up bigger stories into smaller stories. You can follow the INVEST principle or, the SMART principle or the 3 C's to write your user story. Do story estimation, prioritize the stories, identify the dependencies, identify the risks, and make sure it's all spelled out properly in the product backlog after the grooming. Now, types of product backlog grooming. So, we have multiple methods through which the product owner can prioritize the stories, right? One of them is DEEP. Again, it's an acronym. And what does DEEP stand for? D is it has to be detailed appropriately. E is that it has to be estimated. It is a dynamic artifact, and it has to be prioritized. So basically, by detailed appropriately, it means that you should have the higher priority items in the product backlog. They're listed in more detail. They should be fine-grained compared to the lower priority items, which can be coarse-grained because you're not really working on the lower priority items immediately, right? So pay attention to the more immediate items which are high priority. Make sure they are as detailed and fine-grained as possible. Estimated means that the higher priority items, the team should be able to estimate in story points or ideal days or any other estimate methods. Whereas the low priority items, they don't have to be, you're not working on them immediately, so they can just be in the form of epics. E stands for emergent. This is basically means that the product backlog is a dynamic artifact, right? So whenever newer items are discovered, they should be added to the bottom of the product backlog, right? So if there's a product that you're developing or maintaining, the product backlog, you can never complete, right? You can never freeze it. You have to continuously update it based on whatever valuable information that you're constantly getting, based on your changing demands, customer products, demands, things like that. So product backlog is constantly emerging. And then P is for prioritized. So the items in the product backlog have to be prioritized. The highest product priority have to be on top of the product backlog. And this is based on the value that you're delivering. That's how they're prioritized. And lower ones have to be on the lower of the product backlog. All right. Then the other method for product backlog grooming is MOSCO, right? So MO, again, it's an acronym. MO starts for must have. Then S is should have. C is CO is could have. And W is would like to have or probably will not have. So this is also a means of prioritizing the product backlog. So MO means must have, means you basically must have this attribute. It's the highest priority, it's non-negotiable. These are the fundamental requirements, minimal viable, minimal usable list. You need to have it, right? You cannot have a release without it. S is should have. This is the second lower priority. You should have this attribute. It should be included if possible, right? These are important. It's need to have. Without them, the deliverables are still usable, but it's good to have that. C is could have. Again, it's lower priority. It's could have this attribute. It's less critical. It's kind of nice to have. You may or may not have it. It's totally fine. If you have it, that's great. But it's not urgent. You can negotiate on it. W is would like to have, probably will not have. This is like lowest priority, least critical. If we give you the lowest value, you might have it in the future, but it's not going to be. It's not going to be included in your immediate sprint. It's not required now, maybe later, and it's bottom of the requirements. It's not important. It's not urgent. All right. So, if you look at an example of MOSCO, right, and how you will prioritize your user stories in the product backlog, let's say I take the e-commerce website, right? You want to break it up into, priorities, right? So, a must-have would be, a top priority will be a user must be able to sign up, right, in your e-commerce website. They must be able to log in. They must be able to reset their password. And then a should have could be a top priority task, right, which is not a vital function. So a user should be able to choose their payment information. A user should be able to delete their account. A user should choose shipping options. And again, this is, I'm trying to talk about MOSCO from my perspective of, let's say, my organization, what their priority is. Your organization, your priority might be different, and something that is a must-have in my case might be a should-have in your case. So you have to weigh in your, particular prioritization, particular situation, your organization, and then decide which one fits into which bucket. And then could have, basically nice to have, could be, a user will be able to install a mobile app version of your e-commerce website, right? Would have least priority, probably you won't get that, is a user won't choose the app's visual theme for this release. You can, if you want to have a certain visual theme for your website, it's not important. You might reserve it for a future release. You can still release a product without the visual theme. So that's how you kind of break up your user stories. You can prioritize it. So again, this is a graphical representation of your product backlog grooming. You have your product backlog items here. You prioritize it: high priority, low priority. You have your item, you have your size of the user stories. On top, you have the higher priority items, which are fine-grained. Then you have the next priority items, which are medium-grained. And then the lowest priorities, basically, which will be done in future iterations, which are very vague, very coarse. You're not going to spend too much time on them. They're like epics because they will be done at a future time. You will spend more time on the higher priority items and maybe the next priority at as much detail as possible. And then similarly, you can also have a user story map. This, you can have some swim lanes. You can have UML diagrams that shows how the epics, can be broken down into user stories and tasks. So for instance, I have this user story map for e-commerce marketplace website. I can have an activity sequence where I can have epics, right? For browse, order, pay, track. These are all different epics. And they are a group of user stories, right? And then in release 1, I can say, hey, I want to have user stories from epic browse, where, I'm going to group my products into categories, search by categories. In order, I'm going to have, when the customers actually try to order, they can have registration, login, and remove from cart. In the epic pay, I can, say they're going to choose some payment information, verify payment information. Then the epic could be tracking the product, right? So they can have shipping information, sending out shipping confirmation, ad support. In the release 2, I can have more stories to the epic pay, basically where the user is actually paying on the website. So you can have more modes of payment, like, you can have Apple Pay, PayPal, Venmo. In Epic Track, where you're tracking the shipment, you can have order pay. And then in release 3, I can basically have, under browse, I can have smart searches and product suggestions given to the user, right? And then in Epic Track, I can have live tracking of the shipment. So this is how I'm basically, I'm showing graphically, if I want to show a UML diagram to my product owner or my stakeholder. I can basically say, hey, this is my user story map for an e-commerce website, and these are the epics that you wanted me to work on. And these are the user stories from each epic that I'll be doing in every release. So, it makes it more clear to the stakeholder what they'll be getting at the end of a release. And again, I don't want to dwell this slide. This is just an example of a prioritized backlog. You can have the deliverables, you can have a description, and this is just being made in Excel. You can have other application lifecycle management tools. You have Jira version 1, which makes this a much more cleaner process, right? And then for every deliverable here, I've put the planned release date. This marketing is in a future sprint. I have a priority here, and I have an owner here. In this case, the product owner is Mark, so he's the owner. And this is the same view, which you can get in ALM tool, Application Lifecycle Management tool. Moving on, what is a backlog health? So how often should the product backlog be groomed? So we already saw the product backlog grooming is a continuous process, right? The teams can do story grooming once a month or maybe once in 2 weeks whenever the sprint is about to start, depending on your sprint time box. Usually what I like to do is, as a Scrum Master, I like to usually keep twice the velocity of the team stories groomed. So by that I mean, let's say the team velocity, and on an average, I found out is 30 story points in a sprint. So let's say the team is able to do 30 story points in a sprint. I will ask the product owner to keep at least twice the 30 story points, so 60 story points worth of stories groomed, right? So from my perspective, that would be the backlog help. Good backlog help, right? I don't want to have a situation where the team is done and they're just waiting for stories and they're not groomed. That's a big wastage of time. We should always have extra amount of stories groomed, ready to go, so the team is never waiting on stories to be groomed. And what I follow is twice the number of team's velocity, right? So if it's 30, you have 60 story points groomed. If it's 40, you have 80 story points groomed, and so on. Advantages of product backlog grooming, we already saw this. Definition of done, right? So like I mentioned, every story should have an acceptance criteria. There should be a definition of done. So basically done is a minimal product that is in usable condition, right? So the definition of done will provide you the exit criteria that you will define for completing a story, right? And as a rule of thumb, do not include unfinished stories in a demo. I don't like to do that. I just feel it's not good practice to show anything that's unfinished. You can definitely show that you're working on some stories to the product owner, but if it's unfinished, it's best not to demo it because it doesn't give the right picture. As long as it's done, it meets your acceptance criteria, it meets your definition of done, show it by all means to the product owner and get their sign off. That is the whole goal of a sprint demo. And then, don't move the goalpost by this. What I mean is, once the sprint is kicked off, right, you have certain user stories you're working on. The team understands what they need to work on. They know the acceptance criteria. The product owner should, while the sprint is going on, during the sprint process, the product owner should not go and, change the sprint goal. They shouldn't change the acceptance criteria because not only is that a wastage of time for the team because they've already started working on a story, right? Now you go and tell them, hey, you don't have to do ABC, you have to do X, Y, Z. So it's basically you're derailing the team from what they were supposed to do. So that is never a good practice, and not only will your team not be able to produce the right product that they set off in the beginning, but it's also very demotivating for the team as well. So the best practice is once the sprint kicks off, everything is locked in, do not change the sprint goal. Keep it as it was defined for the team. So who is responsible for grooming? The product owner. They will prioritize, clarify doubts. The Scrum Master might facilitate. Okay, the development team can be present. They might understand the requirements and they might even provide estimation. Now, the next step, right? The next ceremony that we're going to talk about is the sprint planning meeting, right? So we have a prioritized product backlog from the product owner. Now, let's go into the sprint planning meeting, which will be facilitated by the Scrum Master, and the development team will be part of it, right? So when you are going to the sprint planning meeting, the input is you need to have a product backlog, which is going to be prioritized. You need to have your team, their capability resources, business condition, that's part of the product, roadmap, technology, current product. Who's going to be part of the product sprint planning meeting? The product owner. It's not mandatory, but sometimes they like to be in the meeting, in case the team has some questions about the product backlog, they can explain it right there and then. The Scrum team, they have to be there. It's compulsory, it's mandatory. Customer, maybe, may not be. It depends. Management, again, they're not mandatory, but the Scrum team, the Scrum Master, they have to be there in the sprint planning meeting. What is the output of the sprint planning meeting? There'll be a sprint goal, okay, and we'll get a sprint backlog. So a sprint backlog will be a subset of the product backlog. So you have the user stories and the tasks that you will be finishing up in that particular time box sprint of 2 to 4 weeks. So it's not going to have all the product backlog prioritized stories. It will only have the stories that you are doing in that particular sprint. So in sprint planning, basically you have the product owner, which will set the priority of the user stories. Then the ideal backlog with selected stories will be selected for the sprint. And then you can have sprint backlog refinement. This is not product backlog refinement. This is sprint backlog refinement and grooming, which should be done by the team. Alright. So what are the parts of the sprint planning meeting? Right? So you come in with the product backlog. You have to determine the sprint goal. And who are the participants? Product owner, the Scrum Master, and the Scrum team. So the main goal of the sprint planning is to create the sprint backlog, right? So the team is going to commit to the stories in the sprint, and they will provide an estimated commitment for the sprint. So they will estimate how much time it will take for them to complete each and every story. Then the projected velocity of the team will be taken into consideration along with the past performance of the team. So basically in the past, historically, how the team has performed, right? What their velocity was. How much time did it take for them to finish stories? Based on that and based on the complexity of the user story in hand, you will give an estimate of how much time it will take for you to finish that particular story. So again, the sprint planning output, you have the sprint goal, you have the definition of done, the exit criteria, and the sprint backlog that will contain all 1, 2, 3 from here. Alright, so let's talk more about the sprint backlog. What is it? It is a highly visible, real-time picture of the work that is owned by the team. Owned by the team. This is very important. The sprint backlog is owned by the team, the development team, right? Not the product owner. So the product owner cannot go and change anything in the sprint backlog. It's owned by the team. They will be making changes there. They will be adding estimates there. They will be tracking it. They'll assign user stories to different individuals in the team, right? But they own it. They are accountable for it. So sprint backlog will define the work or task that the team is doing during turning the product backlog. It defines